George Galloway, and the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, how come you get punished, including by the law, for calling it a duck? Which part of fascism in action are you not recognizing? On the streets and alleyways, in the dust and gore and destruction in Gaza, and indeed in the rampage like drunken sailors, killing and stealing as they go in the occupied West Bank, a territory for which the so-called international community has full legal responsibility. And as they prepare for a gigantic, seismic Russian victory in Ukraine, the mantra has gone in the West from as long as it takes to as long as we can. Mr. Zelensky, no longer effectively the president of the Ukraine, which no longer effectively exists as a state, went to Washington and asked for $66 billion and left with 300 million. And whether that will ever be delivered, at least to him, is a moot point. This is episode 299 of this iteration of the mother of all talk shows. On the brink of an auspicious number on Sunday, let's make it a bumper night. It's the mother of all talk shows. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway, the mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway, the world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
It is an open secret. Zelensky, Ukraine, and NATO have comprehensively lost the war. Stop the war, you fools, as Colonel Douglas McGregor, one of our great guests this evening, is fond of saying. Well, of course, they could have stopped the war hundreds of thousands of lives ago when an agreement was in sight, initialed, on the table in Ankara in Turkey, until Boris Johnson, on the instructions of genocide Joe Biden, flew in to say, we must fight on. He had no intention of fighting on himself, of course. He's never fought anything in his puff. He meant that we would fight on to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. And that last drop is fast approaching. The Ukrainians cannot find enough soldiers, even to man the fortifications they are hurriedly digging. Not only is it now comprehensively, in fact universally accepted, that the so-called counter-offensive, which the NATO powers pushed Ukraine into launching for purely filmic, televisual reasons, has not only failed, but has become a cataclysmic reverse. Not only did the Ukrainians lose tens, scores of thousands of dead men, but they have lost the territory that they thought they were going to be able to defend. Now it is universally accepted, though only systematically leaked in the top people's papers, in the top people's magazines, the FT, the Daily Telegraph, the Economist, and so on. It is accepted, nonetheless, that Russia's advance, when it begins, will go exactly as far as President Putin decides he wants it to go. They are desperately now looking for a way out. Can they negotiate some kind of freeze on the conflict? That's certainly Joe Biden's wish, who said that he wants this war over. Because in an election year, a series of military disasters, with a Russian advance going further and further into western Ukraine, is just about the last thing he needs, on top of the horrific pictures which continue to circulate around America and around the war from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. They want to freeze the conflict, a la North and South Korea. But that would require Russia to agree to freeze the conflict. And why would they do that now that everyone agrees they are winning? I remain of the view, oft expressed on this show, that Russia will seek to liberate not just the city of Odessa, the quintessentially Russian Jewish city of Odessa, but all of the coastline and linking up with Transnistria. And they will insist on a government in Kiev for the rump-stump Western Ukrainian state that is entirely loyal to Moscow and not to Brussels and not to Washington. That will require seismic political change in Kiev. They're already preparing for that. The mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, the famous boxer, and the Zaluzhny, the head of the armed forces, are definitely gathering storm for President Zelensky. It's quite likely that before long, and perhaps before the new year chimes have died away, Zelensky will be on a private plane for Miami or for exile in one of the sumptuous homes he has now miraculously become the owner of. What does that mean? Where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us in Europe cold, hungry, jobless, underemployed, and increasingly forlorn and hopeless about our future. It leaves us with a set of leaders who in 2024 will have to be removed from office because they have committed the cardinal sin of committing national suicide on television. They have committed the cardinal sin of cutting the wrists of their own people and of their own country, their own economy, just to please genocide Joe Biden. As I said on Wednesday, it's one thing to be a vassal of Rome. Julius Caesar was quite the thing. But to be a vassal of Joe Biden, who can't chew gum, walk in a straight line at the same time, who can't tie his shoelaces, who can't put on his shoes, who doesn't know where he is or what he's saying. This week, he told us that October 7th was 65 years ago. So sure of it, he said it 3 times. That instead of 65 days ago, it was 65 years ago. That meant his father could have a walk-on part. He told us that his father had gone back to his kibbutz to look for clothes and artifacts to rescue from the ruins of his house. I'm not making that up. It's easily accessible on the internet for anyone who wants to see it. You really would laugh unless you were already crying. That our leaders, so-called social democrats, so-called Greens, in some cases so-called socialists, have done all this, helped Joe Biden throw that huge boomerang at President Putin, only for it to come back and chop the heads of our own people, of our own governments, is almost too much to bear. But what does it mean for President Putin? Well, looking at the poll we're running tonight, which leader commands more respect around the world, Biden or Putin? Well, I'll let you look at the numbers because I can scarcely believe them. 28,407 people have voted. And in one case, 1% of those responding believed that Biden commanded more respect around the world. And that 1%, I'm sure, were exclusively billeted in Broadmoor, the hospital for the criminally insane in the south of England. On Twitter, only 5% thought Biden commanded more respect. On the YouTube community stream, 3% thought it was Biden. On the YouTube stream of this show itself, 4% thought Biden. These are numbers not to be sneered at. Sure, it's not scientific, but it is massive. It is a poll of almost 30,000 people, and I predict it will be 30,000 people by the end of this show, in which 99, 95, 97, and 96% of the people think that Putin commands more respect around the world. And as a matter of objective truth, who among you can possibly doubt that that is the case? Gayatri and I were in the United Arab Emirates when President Putin arrived last week. The sky was painted red, white, and blue. The cavalcade, the welcome from a historically pro-American Gulf country, had to be seen to be believed. No Russian leader, even at the height of Soviet power, with their alliance with Nasser in Egypt, ever received a welcome like this in the Arab and Muslim world. The same was true when he flew on to Saudi Arabia and then flew to Moscow to receive the president of Iran, President Raisi. The prestige of Russia, the standing of Russia in the world, has to be seen to be compared with Russia lying drunk on the floor under President Yeltsin, having its pocket picked by Western businessmen and Western governments. Now, Russia has won the war in Ukraine. What will happen next? Well, one thing I predict: neither Russia nor China, and certainly not both of them together, are ever going to be pushed around by NATO, by the United States, ever again in any place, anywhere in the world. The world changed, I believe, last Wednesday when President Putin arrived in the Persian Gulf. It will be seen historically as the turning point in world affairs, when multipolarity became a real thing, when the end of unipolar power of American NATO hegemony died a death in the deserts of the Gulf. And the first place that will be tested will be in Palestine. The conflict there, now 3/4 of a century old, more than 3/4 of a century old, will have to be brought to a conclusion. And that conclusion is not the one that Netanyahu wants, and not the one that has been secretly enabled by the European and North American powers. What do I mean by that? Well, on paper, all of the Western governments support a Palestinian state, the so-called two-state solution. All of them, including the United States itself. After all, the Oslo agreements were signed on American soil in the garden of the White House. So everybody in the West is committed to this so-called two-state solution, a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, and including all of the territories of the West Bank occupied militarily since 1967, and the Gaza Strip, and a contiguity between the two parts of that Palestinian state. But here's the rub. Not only is Netanyahu making it clear that there will be no Palestinian state, but more, he is the only man who can stop a Palestinian state being formed. Now, there comes a point at which this circle cannot be squared. If all the European governments, all the North American governments are committed to a Palestinian state, but they are also arming, funding, proselytizing for a government of Israel which makes it clear there will never be a Palestinian state, the point at which that contradiction can be masked, can be obfuscated, has now passed because Russia and China are about to launch a political and diplomatic initiative which will impose that so-called two-state solution, will impose a Palestinian state, and will force all these hypocrite governments that claim that they support such an outcome to come off the fence and to support it. And it's pregnant with the possible rupture and breach, fundamental and final, of the United Nations itself. After all, the Security Council voted with one vote against to demand a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The United States vetoed it. The General Assembly of the United Nations voted with only 10 states against. Well, I say states, but they included Vanuatu, they included the Marshall Islands, they included Micronesia, they included Paraguay, and they included, of course, Israel and the United States itself. The 10 dwarfs, or 8 dwarfs, and Israel and the United States, and then every other country in the world backing the ceasefire and the rapid movement towards a political solution so that this ghastly horror that we have been watching for not 65 years, Joe Biden, but it feels like 65 years. For me, it's not that far off 65 years because I've been watching these things. Sometimes there while they were happening. I have been watching these things for more than half a century. But there comes a point at which all the legal efforts, political efforts, policing efforts to deny people the right to compare what's happening to the Palestinians in their ghetto in Gaza, in their ghetto in the West Bank, with what happened to Jews in the Holocaust of the Second World War, will not be able to succeed. After all, if you are watching, as anyone with access, admittedly fewer than there were a week ago in Britain, access to the Al Jazeera television network, already knows that in a United Nations school, Abu Ghazali school, a United Nations school, women, children, and men were summarily executed at point blank range in a United Nations school over the last 36 hours. People can see the 3 little girls on the roof watching their father burning alive. Everyone has seen it. Everyone has seen the 25,000 children in Gaza who have now lost one or both of their parents. 25,000 orphans, 10,000 dead children, 5,000 dead women. Everyone has seen it. We know what fascism looks like. We studied the Holocaust. Some of us campaigned to make it a criminal offense to deny the Holocaust. But we're being asked to deny a new Holocaust in 2023. No thanks. A woman, remember I told you on Wednesday they were looking for a nice peaches and cream English middle class white woman. They were looking for her because of a placard that she carried. I've now seen the placard. The placard merely compares what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust and what's happening to the Palestinians in Gaza. Well, I've got news for you, Inspector Plod. We all can see that. I'm not a placard carrier myself, but let me metaphorically show it to you now, Inspector Plod. The comparison between what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust and what's happening to the Palestinians right now, this day, this evening. is so brazen, so blatant, so vivid, so streaked in red blood of innocent people that only someone willfully blind or somebody evil would continue to deny it. No, I believe that Israel is led by evil men. I have no doubt that after Netanyahu, another incarnation or iteration of evilness will come to power. I believe that some of our leaders are idiots and some of them are evil. But I don't believe that our people are either idiots or evil. The British people, the French, the European people, the American people, the Canadian people have all shown over the last 65, now 66 days that when they cut them, we know that they surely bleed just like us. Their blood looks like ours. The cries of their children sound like ours. The grief of their parents feels like ours. This is not a world in which, in far-off countries, of which we know little, all kinds of horrors and crimes can be committed. This is a world in which we see them almost in real time. We can watch them live being butchered, and we will not put up with it anymore. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night. It's the mother of all talk shows. A big thanks to the people who support me on the Patreon page. I really have come to depend on the income from that. It costs £1 a week, not even the price of a cup of coffee in an insalubrious cafe. If you think you could stretch to that, please support me on Patreon, patreon.com/George Galloway. Now, the MOATS team have added a tiered system on my Patreon page where you can become an official MOATS graduate. How about that? I speak as someone who graduated from nowhere, from the factory floor in Michelin. But you can become a MOATS graduate and legend. You can give a regular donation to support the show and my work. You can now upgrade from a mere Patreon to a MOATS graduate at £10 a month, as opposed to £5 a month, I think it is. And you can receive official MOATS legend status for £20.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Now, the phone number to call if you have anything to say on what I said or didn't say, should have said, please call us. In the UK and Ireland, free of charge, 08081 965522. That's 08081 965522. In the US and Canada, again, toll free, it's +1 844 944 3344. That's +1 844 944 3344. And in the rest of the world, it's 44203 966 2625. That's 44203 966 2625. Which leader commands more respect around the world? More than 30,000 people have now voted. That's one hell of a poll on a Wednesday night. Which leader commands more respect around the world, Biden or Putin? I like the Telegram result myself. Biden, 1%. Putin, 99%. You can vote on my Telegram channel, t.me/George Galloway, or on my Twitter feed, which is George Galloway, blue tick, on the YouTube community poll, and my goodness, 22,000 people have voted on that, and on the YouTube stream. If you're watching us on the YouTube stream, or for that matter, on Facebook or any platform that allows you to share, please share now with your contacts, with your friends. on that platform so we can continue to confound Mr. Algorithm. Mr. Mohammed Hijab has turned out to be one of the outstanding figures, thinker and a talker in this conflict, and indeed long before. One of the most successful ever guests on the mother of all talk shows. He's the co-founder of the Sapiens Institute. He's an author and a political commentator, and we are always glad to have him on the mother of all talk shows. Mohammed, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. What's your take on the wreckage now? The wreckage of United Nations resolutions ignored, Security Council resolutions vetoed, United Nations schools used as the site of massacre. Doesn't the current international system look to you, as it does to me, like a complete basket case?
Well, I tell you what, I mean, one thing I would say is, one thing I'm reminded of is Shakespeare's saying that not all the perfumes of Arabia cannot sweeten thy hand. And I know you used that yourself in one of your very famous interviews in the past with one of the politicians of this country. And that is what comes to mind, that what can be said and done after what we have seen. Absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned before I've come on, the countries that actually didn't vote for the ceasefire in the UN and the Security Council, some of them I didn't even know were countries, frankly. I mean, as you put it, Micronesia and these kind of things, I didn't know that was actually even a country in itself. So it's very odd and unusual. Obviously, in Europe, the Czech Republic and Austria were the two countries that voted against the ceasefire. I was surprised to see that India voted for it, for example, and we've seen that their rhetoric has been very, pro-Israel, and they actually voted for the ceasefire. So I think with this level of international consensus, this level of international agreement between countries, I mean, it's only a matter of time now, actually. Even Biden, his parlance has shifted, and we're starting to see some level of difference between the American interest and the Zionist interest. And it would seem to be a matter of maybe weeks or months before further action is taken. And we hope that the ceasefire is obviously done. But, I mean, the fact that you still have supporters of something like this, after, as you've mentioned, the kind of wreckage has been barbaric, frankly, is something which beggars belief fully.
You see, I know that these things have happened before. They happened in the 20th century, never mind in medieval times. The Holocaust itself, if it had been televised, would have dwarfed in scale and numbers, if not in quality, so to speak. It would have dwarfed it. Millions and millions of people butchered. But the difference is, in times gone by, we didn't get to see it. We got to see the death camps liberated, almost all of them by the Russians, by the way. We saw the survivors of the Holocaust, but we didn't see the people being massacred in the Holocaust. But now we are watching the people being massacred. It's unbearable, surely. What kind of human being could look at what we're now looking at and not demand an end to this?
I mean, I'm also reminded of another saying that you famously said, which is that we're seeing proponents of the West fight to the last drop in other people's blood. And the opponents of Zionism are doing exactly that. What I found more repugnant than the ones who are perpetrating these crimes are the ones who are supporting these crimes without having to bear any of the risk of those crimes. They don't have to put themselves the tin hat and go forward and fight themselves. They are the ones who are letting other people do that work for them. And they don't mind to see civilians dying in the tens of thousands. They don't even mind to see their own soldiers who they support dying now in the hundreds. The Israeli soldiers are dying in the hundreds. And in fact, every day we're seeing a batch of young men in Israel 18 to 25 or 30 or that kind of age, even women, young women being killed and slaughtered on the front lines in Israel. And this is something which many people, as I say, they are willing to support, but they would never be willing to put their own sons or their own selves on the front line doing that work. So it's absolutely repugnant, and I think it's akin or comparable, at least, to the South African experience in terms of civilian death. It's more dramatic than the South African experience. And in terms of, there was one particular study that came out recently from Haaretz, where a sociologist, and this has actually been reported, I think, by The Guardian as well, was looking at the death counts and doing a ratio study, and he stated that this is, in terms of the time period, one of the bloodiest, death tolls for civilians in the time period that it's had in the 20th century, for the time period. So it's absolutely shocking, and the fact that we can see it makes things even worse. And to be honest with you, in terms of the Holocaust, I mean, there was something called the Evian Conference. I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but there was an opportunity for the Western countries to take in Jewish people. What they saw was this Jewish problem. I think it was in the late 1930s. And they didn't do it because anti-Semitism was rife even in Western Europe. It's a common misconception that people think that the Holocaust was understood or known at the time of when the Allies were fighting the Axis. It wasn't. A lot of these death camps were obviously discovered afterwards. However, having said that, as you've said, if it was something that the whole world would see, I would think that they would have a different attitude. But we saw many people of the German population, they knew something about what was happening, and they did turn a blind eye. And likewise, we're seeing many people in the Western world, they know and they can see what's happening, and they are turning their blind eye. Now,
I spent a long time in Parliament, as you know, Mohammed, and in much of it, the air was full of fear of the radicalization, as they always put it, of Muslims, of Muslim youth. They feared that the Iraq War, the Afghan War, the aftermath of both would sharply uptick the level of radicalization and the danger of young Muslims being lured onto the rocks of separatism and violence. They had multi-million-pound programs, Prevent and so on, which weren't very successful, but you knew at least why they were doing these things. They had a legitimate fear of radicalization. I used to say, a Muslim watching on television what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in Afghanistan, is likely to feel pretty radical. There's no need for a cleric to wind them up. There's no need for a pamphlet to tool them. They have their eyes, they can see what's happening to their co-religionists. So how radical are Muslims around the world feeling right now, watching what's happening in Gaza?
It's a really good question, and I think what's really interesting is that Osama bin Laden himself and members of Al Qaeda and all the associated kind of groups, they would use these kinds of atrocities happening, especially in Palestine, as the key way of recruiting other people. I mean, the fatwas that Osama bin Laden put forward, you will see, and that's the reason why it went viral some weeks ago. In fact, people were reading the fatwas because a big chunk of it was actually dedicated to the Palestine issue. Now, if in terms of what these particular groups actually espouse, what they espouse is that if they kill our civilians, this is effectively a pragmatic kind of consequentialist reasoning. Now, they think that this consequentialism, this Sharia consequentialism, is acceptable from an Islamic perspective, which it isn't, because there's been a consensus for 1,400 years on the matter, and we can quote the classical sources, Ibn Abdul Barr and others from the 13th century, that said there's a consensus on not killing the civilians. But they would use a kind of consequentialist reasoning by saying that actually they're killing our civilians, And so therefore we can kill their civilians. And they will quote verses from the Quran, effectively alluding to the fact that it's a knife for an eye. فَإِذَا عُوقِبْتُمْ فَعَاقِبُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا عُوقِبْتُمْ بِهِ. If you're going to receive consequence, so impose consequence the way in which you receive the consequence. So they generalize the principle and they say, in fact, what that means is if they kill our civilians, we can kill their civilians. And so they use an emotional kind of argumentation and a pragmatic kind of consequentialist reasoning in order to get new recruits. Now, this is a concern. It's a real problem because it flies in the face of Sharia law. It's not normative in any way, shape, or form. But because of the compelling nature of the emotional aspect of this, when a young man who's not acquainted with the minutiae of jurisprudential legalities in Islamic law is presented with a picture of some kid being blown up and then being told actually there is some Islamic justification, it does actually give fuel or adds fuel to the fire of Islamic, for example, takfirism, I would call it. And these groups become more relevant. So in other words, there is a threat here that the Muslim population and the Western populations have to be wary of. And it is a threat that some young men are going to be looking at these things and thinking, well, they're killing our civilians, maybe we have to go and kill theirs, which is a misnotion in Islamic jurisprudence. But why do we want that environment to be to be acceptable or to be creating a facilitation for that kind of environment again? And this is something that the Western governments and powers have to look at, because we don't want to see young Muslim people in this country or anywhere else being radicalized to that effect.
Quite so. And of course, what's true in Britain will, in terms of quantum, be more true in France. There are nearly 10 million Muslims in France, in Belgium, in Germany, in North America even. It is just another factor that we have to put into this equation. We are losing any respect that we had in Muslim countries. I mean, if you run this poll that I'm running tonight in Muslim countries, I mean, the result would be laughable. We're losing respect and friends. We've lost all the very good friends we used to have in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, and so on. And we're also placing our own societies in danger, all to support Netanyahu, who is opposed to the outcome that we claim that we support, namely the two-state solution. Make sense of that for me, Mohammed.
Absolutely. And I think the Americans know that full well, which is why we're seeing a change in parlance. If I had to guess, I would think that the conversation, to put it in simplistic terms, between the Americans and the Israelis at this point is, listen, we're going to give you this amount of time, get the job done, because if you can't get the job done in this amount of time, the status quo cannot remain as it is. It will unstabilize the region. And for the Americans, I do really think that their interests are slightly different, or at least to a large extent, completely different to the Zionist interests, in so much as that they have a region they want to protect. They have trade going through the region. I mean, Yemen, which is the Houthi-controlled Yemen, you have boats going over carrying trade, which can easily be pirated and stopped, and these kind of things. Massive disruption can take place if Hezbollah gets involved. If some escalation takes place, then they can start destroying desalinization plants, places, and other things in Israel itself. They can start destroying the natural gas reserves there. There can be things that take place if there's an escalation, which will ruin the economy in that area, which will have a trickle-down effect in Europe. And the Americans know that. It's not just a political and geopolitical issue, it's an economic issue. And they don't want to see this region being destabilized because they have plans for that region. And so I do think that there is a discussion that the Americans are having with the Israelis that, listen, you've got to do this quickly, because public opinion is also against us, and Biden's got his campaign that he needs to do, and if you look at the polls that have been done on this issue, you'll find that this is not as much a right-left issue as it is a young-old issue, that the ages 18 to 35, the ones who are exposed to the social media, or have access to social media and seeing all these people being killed, which are a key demographic for the Democrats, they will less likely, especially definitely the Muslim community in America, but certainly other communities as well, to vote for the Democrats ever again if this continues. So there are so many things which make this not worthwhile for the Americans, which I'm sure are being put into consideration by them. And so that's why you're seeing a change in parlance with some of Biden's words. And I think that that's the best way to predict what's going to happen in the future. Look at what's in the interest of the Americans. And in this case, we know in the interest of the Americans to stabilize the region for trade purposes, for geopolitical purposes, so that they can have, for them, they can have the colonial outpost, which is Israel in the region, being protected, because they want to see the protection of Israel as well. Of course, that's something Israel wants as well. It's a joint objective. However, this is becoming too much now, and I think in about a month or 2 months' time, we're going to see some serious developments.
Could be a lot of dead people between now and then. As always, Mohammed Hijab, you're a star player. Thanks for coming on the mother of all talk shows. Let me take a quick break, and then it's Scott in New York on the line. Stay tuned. Let's hear from Mehdi. Go ahead, sir.
Hello, George. Thank you very much for taking my call. This is such an honor, because one thing I want to tell you is in 2003, I thought that you, I'll say it, I thought you were a prattling liberal idiot. 20 years later, I'm here honored to speak to you, to say live on air, I'm sorry, I should have listened to you back then. You're bringing the truth to what's going on out there. And one of the things is U.S. policy, whatever it is now, is our government. The problem is that it's run by people with absolutely no honor. They have no shame in what they will do to accomplish what they want. And I really think part of what's going on, that's driving what's going on in Ukraine, is that it's the possibility of all the corruption that it will uncover that has happened there with the influence of our country and NATO since 2014.
Yeah. You spoke extremely powerfully and very graciously, and I'm grateful for it. But you put your finger on, I think, something that's been in the back of my mind for a while. I grew up in a time, indeed I sat in Parliament for almost 30 years, during a time when there were certain standards. There were double standards, of course, and there was a great deal of hypocrisy. But the ruling elite had standards that they tried to keep up. Nowadays, that facade has been torn asunder. Now they're not even pretending to be honorable gentlemen and ladies. Now they're no longer pretending that their institutions, their great departments and ministries are in anything to do with contemporary politics other than an arm of the ruling party. My last word, Mehdi, I ain't no liberal, bruv. I wasn't back in 2003, and I ain't any more liberal today.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Well, 31,000 people have now voted in the poll. Have your say. Which leader commands more respect around the world, Biden or Putin? Scott is on the line from New York. Let's hear from him. Scott, what would you like to say?
George, thank you so much for taking my call. I'm a big fan of yours. One thing I didn't tell the person who filters the calls is I kind of need a girlfriend. So if you could find me a girlfriend, I'd be very grateful to you. But that's a bit of a separate matter. My main question is, there's this UK Parliament member of Parliament, Zahara Sultana, who stood up to the Labour Party whip and voted for a ceasefire. And she's under attack from 1,000 different directions. And I was wondering and she's been giving these interviews, some of in which she's crying. She's crying. So I was wondering if you would be willing, you're sort of a more sturdy kind of dude, And I was wondering if there was some way you could either directly or indirectly take her under your wing and bolster her up so she doesn't just fold. So,
well, she'd need to leave the so-called Labour Party first, Scott. I mean, this is the equivalent of an abused and battered wife remaining in the family home, in the forlorn and useless hope that the beater will stop beating. The continued presence of Muslim people inside the Labour Party is frankly inexplicable. The continued presence, if there is any, of an intention of Muslim people to vote for the Labour Party that is persecuting this young woman would be literally inexplicable. Luckily, in the latter case, it's quite likely that a lifetime of Muslim allegiance to both the Labour Party and the Democratic Party in your country has come to an end. People who always voted Labour will not now do so, and their children will never remember or even understand, if they did remember, why their parents spent so long voting for a Labour Party that hates them, which regularly launches murderous wars against them, from Malaya to Aden to Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, the catastrophe of the Iraq War. I mean, why would any Muslim be in the Labour Party? And why would any actually vote for them? So our doors are open. I'm the leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, fastest growing political party in this country. And I invite all people of goodwill, of all faiths and none, to join us and build something better for the working people of this country. Speaking of which, one of our greatest achievements in the Workers' Party was the establishment of the broad, absolutely broad, no to NATO, no to war movement. 1.8 million people attended our last meeting that I chaired and spoke at, and the next one is tomorrow night at 8 p.m. UK time. Make a note of it, 8 p.m. UK time. The one and only Richard Medhurst, Piers Robinson, and me are speaking. War on two fronts, no to NATO, no to war, tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. UK time. That's 3 p.m. in New York and 9 a.m., I guess that should say. In CET, forgive me, I think it's Central European time, 9 p.m. So Central European time, 9 p.m., 8 p.m. in the UK. Simon, professor, legend in Florida. He's on about world events. Simon, always a pleasure. What have you got cooking for us now?
Good evening, Mr. Galloway. Greetings to you and your worldwide audience. Well, there are some other events, some of which are better than you've cast and some of which, unfortunately, are slightly worse than you've cast. And if I maybe start off with the tidings of joy with some of the extra details in the United Nations Assembly. There was an initial speech before the votes, and there were actually 3 votes because there was the motion that was put forward by the ambassador of Egypt on behalf of the Arab League, co-sponsored by the government of Mauritania on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And at the very outset, Dennis Francis, the current president of the Assembly, gave, quite frankly, an outstanding 8-minute speech. And in minute 2 of that, he described the renewed onslaught, was his word, onslaught on the civilian population of Gaza, and also went so far as to say that the aggressor in that situation, though he didn't use the specific name, was exhibiting, in his words, profound disrespect for international law and international humanitarian law. Now, there was an amendment put forward by the government of Austria that, frankly, has been behaving in a most peculiar manner. And they even went so far as to say that even if their amendment were fully approved, then they still were only willing to go so far as abstaining on the main motion. So, unsurprisingly, that amendment failed. Then the Americans put forward another amendment, essentially with the intention of gutting the meaning of the basic motion. And quite extraordinarily, the lady Ambassador Greenfield of the United States didn't even walk onto the stage to give her speech from the rostrum. She gave it from her allocated seat behind the United States sign. That was rather peculiar. And fortunately, that motion also failed. And the reason why those two failed was because it was not only an emergency session of the UN General Assembly, but it was also suggested and agreed unanimously that they do away with the 100-odd speeches which would doubtlessly have occurred. And it was simply the proposers of the motions and the amendments who actually spoke in addition to the UNGA president. That had the effect of increasing the requirement from 50% to 67% in order for the motion to actually pass. And that appeared on the face of it to be a high hurdle because it was greater than the requirement that had been required on the 27th of October when a ceasefire motion had previously been proposed. But to applause and some cheering from the members of the General Assembly, the final outcome with 153 yes votes was actually 82% of the countries present voting in favor of the motion, which was not just for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, but was also for protection of all civilians, release of all hostages, noting, as we should, that Israel has taken over 3,800 civilian hostages from the West Bank since October the 7th, fact that's often forgotten, and for immediate increased delivery of aid, including through other entry points into Gaza. So that was most welcome. On the negative side, unfortunately, whilst Zelensky had a rather disappointing Tuesday in Washington, D.C., he had a very, very warm welcome from a great assortment of generals and colonels, including the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of the Army, and the Secretary of the Navy, who first listened to a short speech from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin that was followed up by a speech from Mr. Zelensky. Now, as you and I had discussed on one of your previous shows, Lloyd Austin gave his increasingly bombastic type of speech. But in this case, in the space of 1 minute and 50 seconds, he announced 3 determinations from the United States, 3 security issues, and then 3 promises. So 9 effective pledges in 1 minute and 50 seconds, looking once again extremely presidential to the military-industrial complex. Zelensky then had 3 themes, one about the achievements of 2023, another about confidence and security, during which point he quoted Ronald Reagan saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this Berlin Wall," as he said in June of 1987. He then made reference to the wall falling in November of 1989, and the day of his speech was the 82nd anniversary of the American entry into the European theater of World War II. But he failed to mention that that only occurred after Italy and Germany declared war under the terms of the Tripartite Act 4 days after Pearl Harbor. But he also, ending with the admonition to God bless our warriors, got a rounding sequence of applause from all the generals who felt that he was appealing to every man in arms in that very, very diverse group of representatives, in fact, from over 80 countries. So once again, I think we've got a message that's going to the American and the international public, both in relation to Ukraine and in relation to Israel, and another set of words that's being said to the defense contractors and those who are keen to get another round of medals by having the opportunity to fight the communists and religious extremists at their earliest possible opportunity. But unfortunately, the other bad piece of news that occurred on Sunday was the decision by the Israeli cabinet, what is called now Decision 1129, to massively expand the relocation of Israeli settlers into the West Bank. Mr. Smotrich, the Governor General and the current Finance Minister of Israel, is proposing 750,000 to be done on an expedited industrial scale in order to thwart any possible prospect of a two-state solution, bearing in mind that Area C, that is currently controlled by the Israelis, actually represents 60% of the land area of the West Bank. So a mixture there, unfortunately, of some good news and unfortunately some bad news for you and your audience.
A brilliant tour de horizon from our resident professor, Simon, in Florida, a MOATS legend. Trevor is in Edinburgh on Palestine. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Trevor.
Good evening, George, to you and all your listeners throughout the world, because I know that people listen to you in many places. I certainly like promoting your work, and I said to your colleague earlier on before I came on, you are one of the very, very few voices in Britain that are articulating exactly what is wrong in this conflict that we're hearing about on our breakfast TV every single day. Now, I contacted the Prime Minister's office by email and by post and by phone call over the past few weeks. And the one question I wanted to ask was, what are they going to do about this Israel thing? How much influence will they use to stop it? And I was appalled when Britain abstained from the vote. The cowardly sitting on the fence, nothing to do with us, even although this country is up to its eyes with links with the Israeli government and has been for many, many years. The other thing I'd like to point out on this show is that since Israel illegally occupies Palestine, it has no right under international law to actually defend itself against attack. I'm not saying it's got no right to retaliate or that it should sit back if people are killing them, because any country is going to retaliate in some way. But I think their reaction is both illegal and completely out of all proportion to what was done. Because if you were talking about a judge saying, let the punishment fit the crime, well, somebody said to me just yesterday, a Palestinian man that I know that lives in Scotland, and this is exactly, I've written it down, how much is an Israeli life worth compared to a Palestinian? Can we say 18, 25, 30 people? 30 to 1 like the odds on horses? Or can we say that each life is equally valuable? The Israeli people, this is his words, claim to be religious. They claim to follow biblical teachings, as do millions of Palestinian Muslims who follow their Quran. Each side knows from the teachings of their religion that murder is not on. It's against every religion, Christianity, everyone. He finally ended up by saying this, Just imagine there was no hatred in this world. It's easy if people would just try. No warplanes overhead, just a plain blue sky. Imagine all the warmongers doing time in jail. You may think I'm an idealist, but I'm not the only one. I hope right now any ears who hear this will find their voice and help make this world one. God bless everybody, George. That's all I can say.
God bless you, Trevor, for a wonderful call from the capital of Scotland, the great city of Edinburgh, which has been busy, as has Glasgow, as has Dundee and Aberdeen, and even little Dumfries has its weekly protest. The Scottish people, the Irish people, the English people, the Welsh people on this small set of islands have risen to the challenge, even if their leaders have not. Coming up after the break, it is the legendary Colonel Douglas McGregor, formerly a compatriot of mine some generations back. He is not to be missed. Stay tuned.
The 1897 edition of War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Read by George Galloway. Available only on Patreon.
The cylinder was artificial, hollow, with an end that screwed out. Something within the cylinder was unscrewing the top. Good heavens, said Ogilvy. There's a man in it, men in it, half roasted to death, trying to escape. At once, with a quick mental leap, he linked the thing with the flash on Mars. The thought of the confined creature was so dreadful to him that he forgot the heat and went forward to the cylinder to help turn. But luckily, the dull radiation arrested him before he could burn his hands on the still glowing metal.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Now, Colonel Douglas McGregor, retired, is the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. This is a new appointment of his. I'm going to be asking him about that. But he has another of these, like Mohammed Hijab, who had a level of prominence, perhaps in the Beltway, perhaps in some parts of the United States, but has now become a global figure, with people looking out for his analysis, his take on world events. There's nothing he doesn't know about war, about defense, about security, about terrorism. He was in the Pentagon. He was in the White House. He might well have become a United States ambassador. Personally, I have greater ambitions for him than that. He is, as I say, once upon a time, a compatriot of mine with a name like Colonel Douglas McGregor. Welcome, Colonel, to the mother of all talk shows. I'll talk about your new role in a minute, but as you survey the headlines of the top people's papers, hasn't quite filtered down to the news they give to the masses yet, but all the top people's papers, all the top people's fora, are all now preparing each other, and ultimately they'll have to prepare us, the public, for a cataclysmic Russian victory in Ukraine. You predicted this all along. Do you feel vindicated?
I'd feel better about it if this had ended earlier and fewer Ukrainians and Russians had lost their lives in what is really a pointless conflict that never needed to happen.
It's true, isn't it, that every death since the Ankara initialed draft peace agreement has, in a sense, been a death that our governments, yours and mine, bear responsibility for. Because this could all have been over when hundreds of thousands of people that are dead today would still have been alive.
Oh, absolutely. If anything, I would describe this as a Washington vanity project. Lots of people in Washington, supported by friends in London and some other European capitals, decided that they had an opportunity to destroy Russia and that they would use Ukraine for that purpose. And they'd been building up to this for many, many years, not just the 8 years before the war broke out, but actually even earlier, which helps to explain the coup that occurred and the installation of the Zelensky government later on. All of it was fantasy. It made no sense. All the underlying assumptions were wrong. And the usual suspects in the Department of Defense, all of your retired generals and active generals, very few of whom ever had any practical military experience and seldom, if ever, bothered to study their professions, all jumped on the bandwagon predicting imminent victory for Ukraine. And everyone lied prolifically and with great convincing rhetoric day after day that the Russians were awful, they were losing, they had no chance to win. They still haven't admitted the truth, which is we're looking at roughly 500,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. This evening, I heard a retired general say, well, perhaps 125,000. Well, that's a fraction of what we know has happened. And he's still trying to make the argument that if we just spend more money and send more equipment, Ukraine will triumph. In reality, the Russians are advancing deliberately but slowly. I think Mr. Putin is looking for a negotiating partner among the European states. He's not interested in marching to the Polish border. But as I keep telling everyone, if we're stupid enough to refuse to negotiate, if we won't bring this stupid and pointless war to an end, not only will we destroy the Ukrainian nation, but we'll end up moving Russian forces that much further towards the West, which I thought was the very thing we wanted to avoid, as well as the massive expansion of the Russian armed forces. They are now mammoth, very well staffed, brilliantly officered, well led, well equipped. This is not what we set out to achieve.
So does that make our leaders fools or knaves? Fools because they didn't see what you and I could see, or knaves because they could see it and did it anyway?
I think it's probably a little of both. I mean, we've always had a problem. You have in Great Britain and we in the United States with senior military and political leaders who tended to be persuaded by wishful thinking that things were true that were not. This is simply another example. And you add to that corruption and greed and arrogance. I think the arrogance in Washington is at an all-time high. One would think after the decades of failure, military and strategic and political, and given the state of our economy and the financial system, everyone would have developed some measure of humility. Nothing could be further from the truth. No one will admit the truth. Everyone insists on the lie, and the arrogance continues.
It's very disturbing and entirely true also on this side of the Atlantic. He had a bad Tuesday, Zelensky, in Washington, but one of our correspondents has just briefed us that he had a better Wednesday. He had all the brass out there to greet him, and Lloyd Austin booming 9 different pledges in 1 minute, 45 seconds. What happened?
Well, I think he thought that he had access to the Epstein tapes and he was going to present those to President Biden and his colleagues and tell them he was going to release them if they didn't support him. Doesn't seem to have worked. Maybe the tapes weren't good enough, didn't have enough people on them. I don't know. The generals are just waiting around to retire and pick up lucrative contracts with the defense industry. So they're performing not just for their political sponsors that advanced them to senior rank, they're performing for their future bosses and the shareholders. reassuring them that they can sell anything that they produce to anyone. Whether we win or lose doesn't make any difference. And apparently they've got a point. But I think this is going to be tough to conceal. The rest of the world knows what has happened, Mr. Galloway. And what has happened is very clear. Not only has this Western-trained Ukrainian force failed miserably for reasons that are not entirely its fault, but because of the way we trained it, organized it, and equipped it. In addition to that, our technology has failed miserably. Our advice has been appalling. I mean, if in retrospect, I'm surprised President Putin hasn't offered to reimburse London and Washington for the cost of sending all the retired generals over there to advise them, because they've been his greatest assets. It's been stupidity on stilts, an unwillingness to see how profoundly warfare has changed, a desire to see Russians as mediocre and subhuman. It's outrageous nonsense. It was never true. And now, as you know, I'm sure you're aware, we've poisoned the well with Russia for at least a decade or more. I can't imagine why the Russians would pay any attention to anything we say. Everything we've told them was a lie. Everything we've done has been aimed at subverting them and alienating them. And I think that's a serious mistake. I hope we can get a new generation of political leaders in there that can turn it around. But that's, in my judgment, the worst part. And the rest of the world now knows we're weak. And I think that weakness is going to be on display increasingly in the future. And I would include in that the Middle East. We are not the power we were 30 years ago. We're not even close.
Well, undoubtedly, and I was speaking earlier, I was in the UAE when President Putin arrived. You could see, you could feel, it's palpable, the extent to which the formerly, well, to say the least, friends and allies of the West have begun to reorientate towards the East. Insofar as we struggled mightily to lift a huge stone, we really have dropped it on our own feet, haven't we? Russia is stronger and richer. Russia is stronger and militarily more powerful. Its prestige has grown. Its armed forces now tried and tested. It's a thoroughgoing disaster, all this. And the leaders who led us into it really ought to pay a price if democracy means anything.
Well, you've got to get people informed. And this is something that's acutely lacking in the United States. If you ask most Americans, what are you doing tonight? They're looking for the latest football game. They're trying to find out who Taylor Swift is going to date next week. If you ask them about what's happening in the Middle East, they sort of shrug their shoulders. They're not terribly interested. They think this is a minor dust-up that will soon be over, as was the case in previous occasions with the Israelis and the Arabs. And, you know, Arabs have also been through the ringer as well here in the United States. It was easy to convince people that Russians were bad simply because of the Cold War. All you had to do was dust off the Cold War propaganda and throw it at them. Well, now you have the same problem, unfortunately, with Muslim Arabs. Oh, Muslim Arabs, we've been fighting them for years. The hell with them. Let's hope the Israelis do a great job. With no understanding of the situation, of the humanitarian dimension, and no real interest. This is all going to come back and harm us in the long run. But for the moment, strategically, it's not having any impact here. No, nothing is penetrating the American public.
You know far more about warfare than I, but when I look at the situation in the Gulf, in the Red Sea, it looks to me like the asymmetrical warfare in which the common man can inflict wholly disproportionate damage and cost on his enemy. The Houthis, for example, a ragged-assed army, a kind of Taliban on wheels, now have the ability to bring shipping in the Red Sea to a halt at a cost of uncountable billions of dollars for people having to sail their ships around a continent instead, or pay insurance at an exorbitant price because there's a pretty good chance the Houthis will stick a missile up your jumper if you sail past them. This is a remarkable turnaround, isn't it?
Well, the Houthis have actually practically shut down the Suez Canal for much of the commercial traffic. That's a tremendous achievement. We haven't had to have a collision or an explosion in the Suez, and people are now sailing all the way around the Cape to avoid going through the Red Sea. I'm waiting for someone in Washington to make the decision to commit 5,000 or 10,000 Marine infantry or something to land in Yemen. And, you know, based on the experience in Yemen that the British had, I can only imagine that would be a very unrewarding experience dealing with the Houthis and running around in the mountains down there. No one wants to talk to anybody. Again, you know, before you launch, why not talk to people? You know, one thing that the British always did very well before they went anywhere is that they asked this question: how do we practice economy of enemies? Who will work with us and who won't? And eventually they narrowed it down to just a very small number of people who would oppose them. And they had help from others around them. That was Sir Richard Francis Burton, who was a genius at this sort of thing, the real James Bond of the 19th century. We don't have anybody thinking like that. We go in with a sledgehammer. We smash everything. We smash everybody. And then we wonder why nobody likes us and everybody wants us out. We have no friends today in Iraq. Nobody in Syria wants us except some of the Kurds. And it's not even all the Kurds. It's a minority of them. But we've managed to alienate the Iranians, the Turks, as well as all of the Arabs. So I think we're in for a long war. People think, well, you know, the Israelis will finish up in Gaza over the next few weeks. Well, finish up means expel or kill everybody who's left. Now they're going to pump some seawater into the tunnels. I'm sure that'll get rid of some of them, in addition to destroying the water table and making the place unlivable. But I see this as dragging on. I see things changing in the Muslim world. And there's this concept called Asadiyya that goes back to Ibn Khaldun, the famous Muslim historiographer. And he talked about social cohesion and the impact of Islam on the peoples that lived within the Islamic world. And he said, you know, no one has ever seen the power of Islam, fully appreciates what it can do. Well, today the world is different. The people in this region are better educated, they have access to technology, and they know what's happening. Hundreds of millions of people, Turks, Arabs, Iranians, Egyptians, everyone knows what's happening. Anyone who thinks that this is going to end soon is wrong. I think this is the beginning of a very dangerous period. And frankly, I think the Israelis have grossly underestimated the impact of their actions. And at the same time, we don't seem to understand it. We're sitting out there on board our aircraft carriers, waiting for the word to fly strikes. And we're trying very hard to split the Lebanese government from Hezbollah, cutting deals and agreements in the hopes that will keep Hezbollah out. But in the long run, I don't see that happening. I think things are going to get worse, particularly in the spring. We may have a pause, a temporary ceasefire, but this is going to turn into a long, ugly war that none of us are going to like.
I know you're a patriotic American, and I swear I say this not to hurt your feelings at all. But as I watch the decline, steep and rapid, of your president, such that in his latest pronunciamento, he thrice declared that the events of October 7th were 65 years ago instead of 65 days ago, and that allowed him to have a walk-on part for his father, who died 20 years ago, returning to his kibbutz. This is not a well man. As we say in Scotland, you would not send that man out for a loaf, never mind to rule and govern the most powerful country in the world. Of how much more of this can the American people put?
Well, a lot of us have asked that question. I don't think there's any doubt in anybody's mind that Biden is not governing anything. And whatever he says, whatever he signs is put in front of him by other people. The other people are committed to two things. They're committed to the extension of this war in Ukraine. They're committed to unlimited spending. They're committed to backing whatever is required in the Middle East that Israel demands. And they control events. The American people, as I said, aren't paying a great deal of attention right now. But it will take something major to get their attention, something that hits them at home. Now, we've got problems here. Don't mistake that. We have open borders, rising criminality. Lots of Americans are saying, sure, we like the Israelis, but why are we sending all of this money to Israel and Ukraine when we have open borders, when we can't even maintain effective armed forces, when people won't join it? I mean, all this diversity, inclusion, and equity is killing us in the military. And we have so denigrated the role that men play, particularly white men, that the armed forces are suffering for that dramatically. You know, somebody once said, was complaining about the numbers of British soldiers, and Disraeli made the comment, no one complained about the numbers of British soldiers at Waterloo. Well, I like to point out that no one complained about the numbers of white men fighting in the armed forces at Okinawa or Midway or Normandy or anywhere else. But we're in a lot of trouble, Mr. Galloway. We've lost our way. We've lost our sense of purpose. We've lost our sense of identity. And all of these things are going to come out in the months ahead. And I hope that we can weather this and recover. But right now, we are admittedly in a lot of trouble, and we are not in a position to wage a major regional war. And no one should exclude that possibility. That could happen. There are a lot of people in Washington working closely with Jerusalem to spark a war with Iran. And that would be, in my judgment, both unnecessary and catastrophic. If that happens, anyone who thinks that Russia will stand by and watch us destroy Iran is crazy. And the Chinese at this point have enormous investments in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula. They depend heavily on the oil and gas. They don't want to see that shut down. So you're talking about the simple truth is this. No one in the region, in the Near East or Southwest Asia or Eastern Europe wants a war except us.
Chilling indeed. Tell us about your new role, Colonel, Our Country, Our Choice. What is that, and what do you hope to achieve?
Our Country, Our Choice was formed before I showed up by a group of people who simply decided it doesn't make any difference for whom we vote. We get the same bad policies. They've discovered that we have this thing called the Uniparty, where everyone has his hand out, everyone's enriching him or herself. And that's why you don't have debates. You have very few discussions. The fight is over money. It's not over anything of substance. And we're busy falling all over ourselves to ship money overseas, largely because it results in arms sales that enrich people, and no one gives a damn about our border. Oh, a few people raise their hands and say, well, this is bad, that's unfortunate. No one seems to care about the rule of law. So they said, would you come in and be the CEO and try to be a spokesman for the people in the United States who feel disenfranchised? And our numbers are growing rapidly. I think they're going to grow a lot more next year as people begin to figure out, why should I worry about who wins the election when everything stays the same? Who's really going to step forward with a new team and say, it's over, we're going to stop it? Who's going to really cut spending? It's impossible. You can't cut spending. We have to print more money. Well, the more you do, the more likely you are to fall apart. Everybody in the United States understands this, but now I see tens of thousands of people who are coming forward and want this to end. So there are a lot of other issues that we don't like. We don't like the sexualization of children. You know, we're tired of the human trafficking as well as the drugs that pour into our country. We're tired of criminals who are not tried and dealt with as harshly as possible. Everything's out of control. Our internally, we are crumbling. And everybody knows it. And that includes hundreds of thousands of veterans who are going to flock to our colors because they see nowhere else to go, and they're sick of it because many of them have suffered terribly. And the question is, for what? What did we achieve in Afghanistan? What did we achieve in Iraq? What did we achieve anywhere? Well, we all know the answer. Strategically, for us, nothing. But lots of people in Washington live at the top of the food chain. They're doing quite well. In the meantime, food is up 35%, and it's getting worse. People are having trouble putting food on the table. Not in Washington. No, not in the gated neighborhoods, not in Manhattan. You know, we're talking about the average American. This is not going to go on long. So this is what we're about. And we want to end these overseas conflicts. We want to defend the border. We want to expel the illegals. We want to restore the rule of law. But at the same time, we're getting a lot of inquiries from overseas. In fact, a number of people from the continent, India, are asking questions. Can we form a similar chapter? And I think that could happen at some point. And what we're doing now is we're benefiting from the investment that many people are making. We're trying to make it possible for people to join us without spending any money. The last thing we want to do is take money from Americans who need it.
That's extraordinarily powerful message, and I know about messaging. I feel there is, I don't know, an overlap perhaps with Mr. Carlson, Tucker Carlson, who is also an extremely powerful exponent of the kind of counsel of despair at the political class in Washington. Have you thought about joining up together, you and Tucker?
Well, he's been very supportive of us to this point. But we really have spent the last several months building up a new platform. We're going to build a media platform, and we're trying to build membership. We put those together, and our members will then get fact-based news and information. We're also sick to death of the mainstream media. We don't need opinion-based news. What we need to know is what's really happening. You know, stop lying to us about losses. Stop lying to us about the health of our economy. Stop lying to us about criminality. Stop lying to us about the border. We're not stupid. We know we're being lied to. So we're trying to put together something that will stream routinely real fact-based news. And you know that sounds easy. It's not, because when you go on the internet, it's very tough to sort truth from fiction. And occasionally we all make mistakes. But we got to try it, and I think we're going to be successful. But it's going to take time. The more money that comes in, the sooner we go further. And we're going to get a lot of good people, too, to come on board with this that are going to help with the news part. We've got a lot of writers that are coming in, helping to take information, turn it into bites of, say, 500 to 800 words that people can understand. But we're at the beginning, Mr. Galloway. We're just starting. And I think this could be something that a lot of people in a lot of countries would appreciate.
Could well be. Colonel Douglas McGregor, thanks as always for being on the mother of all talk shows. Quick break now from me, and then Chicago and Essex on the line. Told you we're a global university of the airwaves. Stay tuned.
A new dawn has broken, has it not?
He had that Clinton thing. His eyes were round and big and smiley, and he was very charming.
He became this incredible pop idol kind of prime minister.
I think most people who have dealt with me think I'm a pretty straight sort of guy, and I am.
New Labour was backed by the most powerful media interests because they realised he was representing them.
He was caught red-handed trading policy in return for hard cash from a businessman.
America has no truer friend than Great Britain.
Both Bush as well as Tony Blair are now wanting to plunge the world into a Holocaust.
JP Morgan paid him off for the Iraq war. The man is a war criminal.
Is Tony Blair a war criminal? In my opinion, yes.
Most definitely.
The pursuit of money has become the dominant theme in your life.
All these relationships are, in most people's estimation, corrupt relationships.
No previous Labour Prime Minister has behaved in this shameful, money-grubbing way.
How do you sleep at night? You know, it's that. It's as a person.
I do need your support on Patreon. I know I keep saying that to you, and many of you have very generously signed up. But it's really cheap, you know. the price of a cup of tea per week. You get to support my work, which I hope you think is worth the price of a cup of tea. So if you are remotely able to do that, please ask yourself why you haven't yet done so. And join me on patreon.com/George Galloway. Saida is in Chicago, Illinois, but wants to talk about Piers Morgan. Go ahead, Saida.
Hi, Mr. Galloway. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk. I'm a big fan of the show. I just wanted to talk about the good doctor, Dr. Wahid, who came on Piers Morgan's show. And Piers, you know, he started off going on the offensive with his usual cliche question of, do you condemn the October 7th attacks? And then he doubles down on his offensive, asking the doctor about LGBTQ and Sharia law, and almost like pimping him with questions which was absolutely not related to the topic. And he ends it making a case for the good doctor to be fired by NHS. And I am a physician myself, and it was very offensive. And I can't begin to imagine what the doctor was feeling. Had it been here in America, first of all, I would have reported him for Islamophobia, and which he is a big proponent of. He is so anti-Islamic. I would have referred him to the Council of American Islamic Relations, which is our civil rights advocacy group, and then I would have slapped him with a lawsuit for defamation and harassment and dragged his arse to the court. And so I just wanted to know your thoughts on it, Mr. Galloway. Thank you.
Well, it's a very big arse to drag to the court. In fact, he's an arse from head to foot. I am a firm believer on not giving Piers Morgan the oxygen of publicity. I don't know why people are queuing up to go on his show to be interrogated as to their attitude to everything from October 7th to this or that Islamic organization, and then a quick change of gear to their point of view on LGBTQ plus. Why do that for the edification of Rupert Murdoch? If nobody went on his show, nobody would be watching it. These people are going on as fodder for Morgan's gutter journalism on a gutter channel that nobody watched prior to the events of October 7th. It's just cheap clicks for him. He neither believes this or that. He neither believes for or against. He's only calculating the need to get cheap clicks because Rupert Murdoch pays him for that show millions and millions and millions of dollars a year. By contrast with this show, when nobody pays me anything at all. So I think it's better to ignore Morgan, to refuse to go on. If he asked me to go on, I'd say, no, you come on my show. Far more people will see it for a start. And I'll ask the questions. I'll ask you the questions. I'll ask you about your views on sex and marriage and gender in the rest. I promise you, he wouldn't accept the invitation. Shaquille is in Essex, but wants to talk about Israel. Shaquille, go ahead. What would you like to say?
Good evening, Mr. Galloway. Well, much has been said about this Israel-Hamas war. I just want to point out towards one point of hypocrisy, which I find mostly said in the shows like the Piers Morgan show and the like-minded people, who always try to blame that, what Hamas is doing is trying to eradicate Israel from the face of the map. And what Israel is doing is, in response, is to defend itself. It's like a self-defense logic for Israel, but what Hamas is doing is trying to eradicate. Now, this is the biggest hypocrisy we can see around us. Like, for instance, no one knows the intentions. I might say to you, George, that I'm your friend, but at the same time, I might be one of your worst enemy who conspire against you time and over again. And this is exactly what we see Israel is doing with Palestinians. They're saying that we don't want any child killed or any civilian killed, but at the same time, they are killing thousands of civilians without discrimination. They're just bombarding. They have actually almost, bombarded the whole of northern Gaza Strip. And obviously, there is nothing left in Gaza except for rebels. And still they can claim that we are your friend, we're trying to protect you, and all this blah, blah, blah bullshit, which doesn't make any sense to me or to anyone who actually, has a logic behind the things. I mean, look at what Israel has done. From it being nothing prior to 1948, slowly and gradually increasing to almost occupying the whole of Israel and Palestinian area, more than 70% directly, and whatever is left under the blockade. Palestinians don't have a free movement at all whatsoever. And still, people cannot see the hypocrisy that this is what they do is exactly what of opposite what they say. Look at the map of Netanyahu when he showed the map of Israel in the United Nations with no reference to Gaza Strip and West Bank. What does it show? Does it not show the intentions of Israel to take it over completely?
Well, what it shows, Shakil, is from what it shows is from the river to the sea, only the Israeli flag you will see. And Netanyahu is at least being honest about that. The Western leaders who support him, but who claim to support a two-state solution, a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, they're the ones that are lying. They are lying about their support for the Palestinian state, or they are lying that they support Netanyahu. They cannot do both. It's not possible to do both. To claim you support an outcome whilst supporting to the nth degree a person who openly states that he's the only man that can stop the outcome that you claim that you are supporting. So if I was drawing up a chart of for whom I have the greater contempt, whom I despise more, it wouldn't be Netanyahu at the top of that list. It would be the Western leaders who've made it all possible. Now, coming up next is the one and only Gayatri, my good wife, in my own library with the social media roundup. I always like this time of the evening. I hope she does too. Gayatri, welcome to the show. What's rattling?
Yes, of course, I like it too, this segment, because I've got quite few good emails coming in, starting with Patreon. Silas asks, George, can you recommend 2 or 3 Palestinian charities that can get aid through to the needy without it being hijacked and sold on the black market? I want my donations to count. And then, good evening, George. Thank you for accepting me as a patron. I am a member of the Workers' Party and an avid follower of you on MOATS. In fact, we have spoken via me calling in, and I do hope I'm able to get through to you again on MOATS at some point. We live in extraordinary times and politically dangerous times. I applaud your continued support for the little guy, and they don't come much politically smaller than the Palestinian people. Bless you for your waving flag, and my sincere best wishes to you and your family from Tony Raybold. And then here's an email from Prestwich in England, should countries supporting the apartheid government in Israel be required to accept the Palestinian refugees from uninhabitable Gaza and forthcoming uninhabitable West Bank? Gordon Niven is that from.
Well, there's no doubt that the plan is to make Gaza uninhabitable. On top of the horsemen of the apocalypse already galloping through this tiny territory with its tightly packed civilian population, we can now add biblical floods. So we have people carrying injured people and carrying dead bodies up to their waist in flood water. We have a complete collapse of the sewage and sanitation system. We have a virtually complete collapse of the health system. Hospitals no longer working, no longer with power, no longer with medicine, with the basic medicine. The great British Palestinian surgeon, Mohammed Abu Sita, gave evidence in Parliament today about amputations, dozens of them, which he conducted of the limbs of children using vinegar and washing up liquid to keep the wounds clean. No anesthetic at all. Vinegar and washing up liquid, oftentimes operating to candle light. So a destruction of the health system, a destruction of the sewage and sanitation system, now starvation, and now floods. Soon there will be epidemics of all kinds sweeping through the Palestinian population. So it isn't just the bombing. And even today they have joined the new tactic of point-blank execution in a United Nations school of women and children, refugees in a school, cowering there, away from the bombs. The soldiers entered and murdered them in cold blood. 20 dead, 45 wounded in a United Nations school. Now, in the face of such crimes, the gravity of that is almost difficult to calibrate the scale of that evil and criminality. The question is, what are the governments of the world doing about it? And the answer to that is nothing. Your country, Indonesia, has a hospital ship 2 miles off the coast, packed full of medical facilities, medicine, and doctors and nurses. Israel will not give it permission to dock and to minister to this people in the face of this set of disasters. Well, I know that Indonesia is not a strong country and probably will not feel able to dock its hospital ship. So I call again on those countries that Israel could not dare to attack to send their hospital ships into Gaza. And I mean Russia. I mean China. I mean Turkey. Send now, urgently, right now, the means to rescue millions of people who, if they're not torn to pieces by high-powered American ordnance, are going to die of disease, of dirty water, of no sewage, no sanitation of any kind. I mean, otherwise you're responsible. If you have the means to do something, to save someone, and you do not do it, You are as responsible for what happens as the people who carried out the crime themselves. Well, look, thanks for all of those. Have you got any more?
No, you're right. I just want to say that my country, Indonesia, is indeed not yet the superpower it is to be, but we will never leave behind the cause for Palestine. We will always stand with the Palestinian people. And as you know, our foreign minister, Ibu Retno, she's not sat idle at all since the 7th of October. She's been traveling and doing her part, making the pledge and doing whatever we can, as you say, with the hospital. We've already bombed the hospital that the Indonesian people built in Gaza and for the people in Gaza. And our hospital ship is ready there. And we do what we can do. And as you say, there is no limit.
They destroyed your hospital already.
Yeah, they destroyed
the Indonesia hospital in Gaza is completely non-functional.
That came from the Indonesian
children
people,
were left in incubators to die there. Sorry?
No, I just wanted to say that came directly from the Indonesian people. So we stand forever with Palestine.
For sure. And your foreign minister was a guest at our wedding. And we met in Paris recently. Dr. Fadli Zon, the powerful Indonesian member of parliament, who is basically touring day and night, trying to get some kind of initiative off the ground. So more power to their elbow. And to you, thanks very much for joining us. Kiss the children for me, please. That's my good wife, Gayatri, bringing us a roundup of social media. Let's go back to the lines for the last 15 minutes of the show to Liverpool, where Terry wants to speak about Palestine. Terry, welcome.
Hi, Terry. Sorry, I'm George.
Hi.
Hi, George. Yeah, brilliant monologue as usual. There's one thing I wanted to say before I get to the point is that I've had an idea of printing up some cards with your details on, MOATS, and all the contact details, and saying, if you want to nail the truth, listen to MOATS. So I hope that's a good idea, and everybody can take that
Good
up.
idea, very good idea. I don't know why we haven't thought of that. We could be giving them out at these demonstrations all over the country.
Yeah, I do it to like-minded people. I say, listen, if you want to know the truth, this is what you have to listen to. And also, other people like Scott Ritter, who've got all the predictions right. And it didn't take much common sense to know that this is where it was going, and how we could predict what would happen. But there's no doubt about it that in Gaza it's genocide, and like you say, you've either got to be evil or stupid not to realise it.
Mm-hmm. Well, isn't it funny, Tel, that those that know something about war, like Scott Ritter, like Colonel Macgregor, are on our side of the argument, and those who've never seen or heard a shot fired in anger, who couldn't fight their own way out of a wet paper bag. Anybody fancy a fight with Rishi Sunak? Anybody fancy a fight with Grant Green or Shapps or whatever he's calling himself today? These are people entirely ignorant of war and its effect. And yet the people who know about war are all on our side of the argument. Terry, last word to you.
Yeah, that's spot on again, George. And it's like you said that people are wanting to fight to the last drop of blood of someone else's son. Well, I'm like you. I've got sons, and I don't want them to go and lose their lives and fight in a lost cause and an unjust cause.
No sons of mine will shed their blood for Zelensky or Netanyahu. Right. No. That is for sure. We're ready to defend our own country, and we'd gladly die on our own country's soil, defending it against any attacker or invader. I would have been if Hitler had succeeded in conquering us I would have been a member of the British resistance, which would have stretched from Winston Churchill to Harry Pollitt. And so would you, although some of our people would have been out trying to sell financial services to the invading occupier. Terry, thanks for that great call. Let's go to Morocco, who wouldn't, where Michael wants to talk about Piers Morgan. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, good evening, sir.
Good evening.
How are you, sir? I want to talk about Piers Morgan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You need to turn the volume down
on
your device. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry. I got a problem with Piers Morgan from October 7th. His show is based on October 7th, and all the program he talk about Hamas is terrorists. I disagree that Hamas is terrorists. Before October 7th, the Palestinians have been suffering for the past more than 5 decades. So between Hamas and Israel, who defending themselves? They say defend Israel and Hamas. Who defending themselves? That's what I wanted to know. Because Piers Morgan, in program, he always talking about Hamas is terrorists. Hamas and Israel, who is terrorists?
Well, when someone says to me, what about October 7th? I say, what about October 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st? What about the previous October? What about the October before that? What about all the Octobers in the last 75 years and more? What about the October of 1948 when the Palestinian people were driven out in their hundreds of thousands? Some of them as refugees still in Gaza, others scattered across the world to the 4 corners of the earth, from the Arctic Circle to South America, every part of Europe, Africa, Asia, the Arab world. What about those Octobers? What about the Octobers in which the people of the West Bank and Gaza have been systematically starved, slaughtered, invaded, occupied, repressed, imprisoned, tortured? What about all those Octobers? The story doesn't begin when Sky News turns up. That's not when the clock begins. The clock begins when it began. The story began when the story began. And it began in the promise more than 100 years ago by the British government, which promised to one group of people the land which belonged to an entirely different group of people, and promised it to them, but with the proviso that nothing will be done that will prejudice the rights of those whose land it actually is, and then completely ignored and defied that second paragraph of the promise. October 7th, terrorism? You want to talk to me, Piers, about terrorism? The people running Israel today invented modern terrorism. They tried to murder Winston Churchill when he was fighting Adolf Hitler. They tried to bomb the Foreign Office when we were at war with Adolf Hitler. They murdered a British minister, Lord Moyne. They murdered the United Nations envoy, Count Bernadotte. They murdered British soldiers, service people, policemen, civil servants. They invented terrorism. There's a reason, you know, and why the late Her Majesty the Queen never, ever, ever visited Israel. Although she went everywhere else in the world, she would never visit Israel. Why? Because British citizens, servicemen, policemen, civil servants, British government institutions were murdered and destroyed by terrorists from exactly the same political organization founded by Jabotinsky, calling themselves revisionists, fashioning themselves upon Mussolini's fascism. These people are running Israel today. That's why the Queen never went there. She refused to go there. Well, if it's good enough for Her Majesty, God rest her soul, good enough for me. Michael, last call, I think, of the evening from Nova Scotia in Canada on Biden. Michael, go ahead, please.
Hello, George. My name is Michel. I'm a bilingual French-Canadian, and I'm living in Nova Scotia.
My apologies. You're welcome, sir.
I'm a Catholic living in Nova Scotia, watching how, like your previous caller said, how honesty, honorability, integrity, and reliability has disappeared in everybody. And the COVID-19 was like a form of vampirism that happened over the world, with half the professionals going along being forced by their union to be vaccinated, and then having to choose between either keeping a job and not saying anything, or leaving their work. And we are facing 30% lack of health personnel. They left because they didn't want to be vaccinated. We had police that became very abusive due to Trudeau forcism. And I am watching that most of the professional educated under the Jesuit system in Canada have become professional gangsters.
Well, I think you're right. And it's not restricted to Canada, but Canada is a pretty good case in point. I mean, the people running Canada are supposedly the Liberals. What's liberal about Justin Trudeau? Sure, he wears the rainbow, he's left his wife, he's often seen in the company of handsome, comely young men. I don't know if he takes a toke or two, but that would be the only smattering of liberalism in Justin Trudeau, wouldn't it? His handling of the COVID, his handling of the truckers, his handling of anyone who stood up for their own rights over their own bodies, over their right to refuse forced medication. What was liberal about that? What is liberal about supporting Netanyahu on a murderous fascistic rampage against unarmed civilian women and children? What's liberal about supporting Zelensky and the Azov and the Nazi battalions of the Black Hundreds of Ukrainian nationalism? What's liberal about that? And that is true across all of the Western countries who claim to stand for things the direct opposite of which they are doing and imposing. Don't get me started on Trudeau, Michel. But God bless you, a Roman Catholic in Nova Scotia. And my apologies for getting your name wrong. I've got to clear the lines because there's a legend, Norma in Bristol, who wants to talk to us. Norma, welcome.
Hello, George. I just wanted to relay a couple of little stories because there's so much horrors and things we're hearing about no ceasefire from the Parliament, and it's all very despairing and depressing. I just wanted to say two little stories about how some people are very nice, and they. This is it. When my husband died, the next day, a man from the was going to service my boiler. He came around, and I told him, and he left. And then an hour later, he rang the bell, and he gave me a big bunch of flowers. Now, I didn't know him. And similarly, a friend of mine from London rang me yesterday, and she's 86 years, and a year older than me. And she told me that a young man saw her struggling with her shopping, and he went out of his way, took her shopping, and made sure that she got on the bus. And of course, you know, you and MOATS, you've always been very kind to me. But just to make a change, I thought these people were strangers, but they had something so nice about them. So I thought I'd finish the show on a gentle note.
Well, look, Norma, there's two kinds of people in the world, and there's two competing forces within each of us. If I make if you like, a metaphor of it, there's a good and a bad on either of our shoulders, and our conscience tells us what we should be doing and when we have done the wrong thing. And the same is true in the world as a whole. For every gangster and thief and immoral thug and liar and cheat that there is in the world, there are others who are positively saintly. And we all come across them. I was myself today at a nativity play where a very idealized version of Bethlehem was the backdrop to it. But all these little children dressed up, singing about the baby Jesus and so on. This is purity and goodness. All these teachers who often in their own time made it all possible. The parish priest sitting next to me, filled with Christian feeling and goodwill. The other parents that were all around me are all examples of goodness. And goodness is everywhere. Just as evil is present everywhere, goodness also is present everywhere. And our job, my job, I have always seen it this way, is to do what I can to ensure that good vanquishes evil. And that within myself, I always follow what my conscience tells me is good rather than evil. And if we all do that, a better world will result for our children and their children. Norma in Bristol, bringing the show to an end. I'm sorry that we have overshot again, not least because it cost me more money. When we do, the votes cast were 33,672, and 99%, 95%, 97%, 94% say that Putin, rather than Biden, commands more respect around the world. A no-brainer in a way, but that so many people voted in this poll to express that no-brainer ought to be significant, ought to be regarded as significant. Well, look, breaking news in the last few minutes. The US House of Representatives has just voted in favor of giving more power to the impeachment inquiry into President Biden over corruption allegations. This vote now formally authorizes the congressional investigation, which will lead to the impeachment of Joe Biden. The vote was 221 votes in favor, 212 votes against. That may very well turn out to be hugely significant. We'll discuss it in our 300th edition of the Mother of All Talk Shows on Sunday. That's right, on Sunday, an auspicious day, the 300th edition of the Mother of All Talk Shows, which millions of people are watching, all or in part, every single week. Thanks to you. Good night.